The November wind howled through the barren hills of eastern Tennessee, carrying with it the acrid smell of coal smoke and something else, something indefinable and disturbing that made the horses nervous as they pulled the carriage up the winding road toward Rosewood Asylum. The trees lining the path were skeletal and black against the grey sky, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. Inside the carriage, Thomas Brennan gripped his leather journal tightly, his knuckles white against the worn cover. The journal had been his sister Margaret's gift to him when he first became a reporter, the leather now cracked and stained from years of use. At 28 years old, he had seen his share of human suffering in his work for the Nashville Tribune, covering factory accidents, mining disasters, and the aftermath of the war that had torn the nation apart. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he would discover behind the iron gates of Rosewood. Nothing could have steeled him for the horrors that waited in the shadows of that terrible place. The asylum loomed against the grey November sky like a monument to despair, its red brick walls stained black with soot and age, the mortar crumbling in places to reveal the darker brick beneath. 3 stories of barred windows stared down at the approaching carriage like hollow eyes, empty and accusing. Some of the windows were broken, stuffed with rags or boarded over with rotting wood. Others showed pale faces pressed against the glass, watching his arrival with expressions ranging from desperate hope to vacant indifference. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold, a primal warning that screamed at him to turn back, to flee this place while he still could. But he forced himself to remain calm, to remember why he had come. Justice for Margaret. Truth for all those who had suffered in places like this. He would not turn away. Dr. Elias Crane, the asylum's director and chief surgeon, had a reputation that preceded him throughout the state. A graduate of the University of Pennsylvania's medical school, he had published several papers on the treatment of mental afflictions through what he called progressive surgery. The medical establishment in Nashville whispered about his methods, some with admiration for his bold innovations, others with thinly veiled disgust. But no one had concrete evidence of wrongdoing, and in 1873, the insane were considered little more than animals, their treatment a matter of institutional discretion rather than public concern. The anonymous letter that had brought Thomas to Rosewood had arrived 3 weeks ago, delivered to his office at the Nashville Tribune in a plain brown envelope with no return address. The letter had been written in a shaking hand, the ink smudged in places as if tears had fallen on the paper while it was being composed. It spoke of horrors beyond imagination, of screams that echoed through the corridors at night, of patients who entered the operating theatre and never emerged whole, their bodies butchered in the name of medical progress. The writer described procedures performed without adequate anesthetic, organs removed from living subjects who pleaded for mercy, deaths covered up and attributed to the patient's existing mental conditions. Most disturbing were the details about Dr. Crane himself, his cold detachment as he cut into conscious patients, his clinical notes describing their suffering as if they were nothing more than laboratory animals. The letter had been unsigned, but it bore the official seal of Rosewood Asylum, pressed into red wax at the bottom, a detail that convinced Thomas the source was authentic, even while protecting the writer's identity. Thomas had convinced his editor to let him write a series on Tennessee's asylum system, arguing that the public had a right to know how their tax dollars were being spent. The truth was more personal. His younger sister, Margaret, had been committed to an asylum in Memphis 2 years ago, after a nervous breakdown following the death of her husband in a mining accident. She had never recovered, dying 6 months into her confinement under circumstances the asylum administrators called natural causes. Thomas had never believed them. The anonymous letter from Rosewood had awakened something in him. A desperate need to understand what happened to people like Margaret when they disappeared behind asylum walls. The carriage stopped at the front gate, where a guard in a worn grey uniform emerged from a small gatehouse. His face was weathered and hard, his eyes suspicious as he approached. Thomas handed him the letter of introduction he had received from Dr. Crane himself, carefully forged on Tribune letterhead by a sympathetic printer who owed Thomas a favour. The guard studied it for a long moment before nodding and unlocking the gate. The grounds of Rosewood Asylum spread out before Thomas like a vision of institutional order imposed upon the wild Tennessee landscape. Bare trees lined gravel paths that connected various outbuildings to the main structure. To the left, he could see what appeared to be a workyard where several patients in grey uniforms laboured under the watchful eyes of attendants. To the right stood a newer building, its red brick cleaner than the main structure, with a chimney that belched dark smoke into the overcast sky. The operating theatre, Thomas thought, and felt his stomach clench. A thin man in a black suit waited at the main entrance, his face angular and severe. This was Dr. Edmund Vale, the assistant director, who would serve as Thomas's guide during his visit. Vale's handshake was cold and perfunctory, his smile never reaching his pale blue eyes. "Mr. Brennan, welcome to Rosewood," Vale said, his voice carrying the clipped tones of New England breeding. "Dr. Crane is currently engaged with a patient, but will join us shortly. Please follow me." The interior of Rosewood Asylum was a study in contrasts. The entrance hall was grand, with high ceilings and ornate moulding that spoke of the building's original purpose as a private mansion before being converted to institutional use. But the grandeur ended at the doors leading deeper into the facility. Beyond them lay a maze of narrow corridors painted in sickly green, lit by gas lamps that cast more shadow than light. The air was thick with the smell of carbolic acid, unwashed bodies, and something else, something organic and wrong that made Thomas's throat tighten. Vale led him through the main ward, where patients sat on wooden benches or shuffled aimlessly along the walls. Some muttered to themselves, others stared into space with empty eyes. A woman in a stained grey dress reached out to Thomas as he passed, her fingers grasping at his coat. An attendant, a heavy-set man with brutal hands, roughly pulled her back and shoved her toward the wall. The woman whimpered, but said nothing more. "We house 143 patients currently," Vale explained, his tone clinical and detached. "Most are charity cases, sent here by county authorities or families unable to care for them. We receive a stipend from the state for each patient, which barely covers the cost of their maintenance. Dr. Crane's research grants provide the additional funding necessary to maintain the facility and advance the science of mental treatment." "Research grants?" Thomas asked, pulling out his journal to take notes. "Dr. Crane is pioneering new surgical techniques for the treatment of various mental afflictions," Vale said, a note of pride entering his voice. "He has received funding from several prestigious institutions, including the American Medical Association. His work on the removal of diseased tissue from the brain has shown promising results in cases of violent mania and melancholia." They climbed a narrow staircase to the second floor, where the patients were segregated by the nature of their afflictions. The violent cases were kept in locked cells, their walls padded with stained canvas. The melancholic patients were housed in dormitories, lying in narrow iron beds or sitting on the floor, rocking back and forth. A young woman, no more than 20, caught Thomas's eye. She was beautiful despite her hollow cheeks and haunted eyes, her dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders. She stared at him with such intensity that he stopped. "That's Sarah Winters," Vale said, noticing Thomas's interest. "Admitted 6 months ago for hysteria and religious mania. She claimed to hear voices telling her to speak out against the mistreatment of women in her community. Her husband had her committed. She's scheduled for surgery next week." Dr. Crane believes that removal of a portion of her ovaries will cure her affliction. Thomas felt ice in his veins. Her ovaries. But she's not suffering from any disease of the reproductive organs, is she? Vale smiled thinly. Modern medical science has established clear connections between the female reproductive system and mental stability, Mr. Brennan. Surely you've read Dr. Crane's papers on the subject. The removal of diseased ovarian tissue has proven remarkably effective in treating female hysteria. Many of our patients have shown significant improvement after the procedure. And those who don't improve? Thomas asked carefully. Medicine is not an exact science, Vale replied, his tone suggesting the conversation was closed. We lose patients, as does every medical institution, but the progress we make justifies the occasional setback. Come, Dr. Crane should be free now. They descended to the first floor and crossed to the newer building Thomas had noticed from the carriage. As they approached, Thomas could hear sounds from within, a low moaning that made his skin crawl. Vale seemed not to notice, pushing open the heavy door and leading Thomas into a vestibule that smelled overwhelmingly of chloroform and blood. Dr. Crane prefers to work without distraction, Vale said, but he has agreed to meet with you. Please wait here. Vale disappeared through an inner door, leaving Thomas alone with his racing thoughts. He could hear voices now, low and urgent, and underneath them that terrible moaning. He moved closer to the door, pressing his ear against the wood. "Hold her still, damn you!" a voice commanded, refined but edged with irritation. "The anesthetic is wearing off. Give her more chloroform." "Doctor, she's already had twice the normal dose," another voice protested. "Then give her a third. I'm not finished. Hand me the smaller scalpel." Thomas heard a scream then, high and pure, and filled with such agony that he stumbled backward from the door. It cut off abruptly, replaced by a wet, gurgling sound that made his stomach heave. He was still standing there, trembling, when Vale emerged from the operating theatre. "Dr. Crane will see you now," Vale said, his expression unreadable. "Please, come in." The operating theatre was circular, with tiered seating rising around a central operating table. Gas lamps hung from the ceiling, bathing the space in harsh white light. The table was occupied by a young woman, her body covered with a sheet stained red in several places. Her eyes were half open, rolling wildly, and she was making small, desperate sounds deep in her throat. Several attendants held her down, while a man in a blood-spattered surgical gown worked over her exposed abdomen. Dr. Elias Crane looked up as Thomas entered, his face partially obscured by a surgical mask. What Thomas could see of the man was striking, sharp features, greying hair swept back from a high forehead, and eyes of such pale green they seemed almost colourless. He was in his mid-50s, Thomas guessed, with the bearing of a man accustomed to absolute authority. "Mr. Brennan," Crane said, his voice muffled by the mask. "Forgive me for not shaking hands. I'm just finishing up here. A fascinating case. A young woman suffering from acute nymphomania. I'm removing her ovaries and a portion of her uterus. With these diseased organs gone, she should return to a state of normal feminine modesty and comportment." Thomas forced himself to look at the patient's face. She was perhaps 19 years old, with blonde hair matted with sweat. Her lips moved soundlessly, and tears streamed from the corners of her eyes. Their gazes met for a moment, and Thomas saw in her eyes a plea so desperate it made his chest ache. Is she conscious?" Thomas managed to ask. "Minimally," Crane replied, tying off a vessel with practiced efficiency. "The chloroform keeps her docile, but full unconsciousness isn't necessary for this type of procedure. In fact, some responsiveness is desirable, so I can gauge the effects of my work in real time. There, finished. Take her to Recovery Ward 3. The attendants lifted the woman from the table, and Thomas caught a glimpse of the gaping wound in her abdomen before they covered her with a fresh sheet. They carried her through a side door, her head lolling, and Thomas heard her moan fade into the distance. Crane stripped off his surgical gown and mask, revealing a face that would have been handsome if not for the coldness in his eyes. He washed his hands in a basin of carbolic acid solution, then turned to face Thomas with a smile that never reached those pale green eyes. "Now then, Mr. Brennan, shall we discuss how Rosewood Asylum is revolutionizing the treatment of mental disease?" Over the next hour, Crane led Thomas on a tour of the facility that was clearly designed to impress. He spoke eloquently about his theories of mental illness, explaining how various afflictions could be traced to physical abnormalities in the brain or reproductive organs. He showed Thomas his collection of preserved specimens, brains and organs floating in jars of formaldehyde, each carefully labeled with the patient's name and diagnosis. He produced charts and graphs demonstrating the supposed success rates of his surgical interventions, but Thomas was no longer listening to the words. He was watching Crane's face, the animation that entered those cold eyes when he discussed his work, the way his hands moved as he described cutting into living flesh. This was not a doctor driven by compassion for the suffering. This was a man intoxicated by his own power, by his ability to open human bodies and rearrange their contents according to his theories. As darkness fell over Rosewood Asylum, Crane invited Thomas to stay for dinner and to spend the night in one of the guest rooms. Thomas accepted, knowing that he needed more time to gather evidence, to understand the full scope of what was happening within these walls. They dined in Crane's private quarters, a surprisingly elegant apartment on the third floor with mahogany furniture and silk curtains. The food was excellent, far better than the thin gruel Thomas had seen being distributed to the patients. "You seem troubled, Mr. Brennan," Crane observed over brandy after the meal. "I hope nothing you've seen today has disturbed you. I assure you, everything we do here is in service of advancing medical knowledge and alleviating human suffering." "The woman in the operating theatre," Thomas said carefully. "She seemed to be in considerable pain." Crane waved a dismissive hand. "Pain is temporary. Her affliction was permanent. In a week she'll be a new woman, cured of the deviant urges that tormented her. Her family will be grateful. And if she's not cured, then we'll try another approach," Crane said simply. "Science progresses through experimentation, Mr. Brennan. Every failure teaches us something valuable. You, of all people, should understand this. The press is free because people were willing to fight for that freedom, to make sacrifices. Medical science advances because doctors like me are willing to push beyond the comfortable boundaries of conventional treatment." Thomas recognized the manipulation in Crane's words, the attempt to frame his butchery as a kind of liberation. "And what of the patient's freedom?" he asked. "What choice do they have in these experiments?" Crane's expression hardened. "The insane have forfeited their freedom by virtue of their inability to function in civilized society. It is the responsibility of institutions like Rosewood to manage them, to protect the public, and to seek cures for their afflictions. They should be grateful for our care, even when that care kills them." "Every treatment carries risks," Crane replied coldly. "I've lost patients, yes, but I've also cured many more. The ratio is acceptable." That night, lying in a narrow bed in one of Rosewood's guest rooms, Thomas could not sleep. The building was never silent. Moans and cries echoed through the corridors, the sound of chains rattling, doors slamming, footsteps pacing endlessly overhead. Around midnight, he heard screaming from somewhere below, a man's voice rising in terror before being abruptly cut off. Thomas got up and pressed his ear to the door, listening to the muffled sounds of activity in the building. He made a decision then. He would not wait until morning to continue his investigation. He needed to see what happened at Rosewood when there were no visitors to impress, no reporters to deceive. He dressed quickly and eased his door open, peering into the dimly lit corridor. It was empty, the gas lamps turned down low. Thomas slipped out and made his way toward the main staircase. The second floor was quiet, most of the patients locked in their rooms or dormitories for the night. But as Thomas descended toward the first floor, he heard voices coming from the direction of the operating theatre. He moved carefully through the shadows, his heart pounding, until he reached a window that looked into the theatre. What he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his life. 4 patients, 2 men and 2 women, were strapped to tables arranged in a row. They were all conscious, their eyes wide with terror, cloth gags in their mouths. Dr. Crane and Dr. Vale were working over them, assisted by 2 attendants. As Thomas watched in horror, Crane made an incision in one man's chest, spreading the ribs to expose the beating heart beneath. "Note the increased heart rate," Crane said to Vale, his voice clinical, "indicative of the fear response. Now watch what happens when I apply pressure to the pericardium." The man on the table convulsed, his back arching, muffled screams tearing from his throat behind the gag. Crane adjusted his grip and pressed harder. The man's convulsions grew more violent until suddenly he went still, his eyes fixed and staring. "Fascinating," Crane murmured. The cessation was almost instantaneous. "Make a note of the time. Now let's see if we can replicate the result with subject 2. Thomas turned away, pressing his hand to his mouth to keep from vomiting. He stumbled through the darkness, no longer caring about stealth, desperate only to get away from the horror he had witnessed. He made it to the entrance hall before strong hands grabbed him from behind, pulling him roughly backward. "Found him trying to leave, Doctor," a gruff voice said. It was one of the attendants, the brutal-faced man Thomas had seen on the ward earlier. Dr. Vale appeared from the shadows, his expression no longer cold, but actively malevolent. "I wondered how long it would take you to reveal your true purpose here, Mr. Brennan. Or should I say, Mr. Thomas Brennan, brother of the late Margaret Brennan, formerly a patient at Hillside Asylum in Memphis." Thomas's blood turned to ice. "You knew." "We know everything about everyone who comes here," Vale said. "Dr. Crane is many things, but careless is not one of them. Your forged letter of introduction was obvious from the start. We've been watching you all day, waiting to see what you would do. And now you've seen things that no one outside these walls can ever know about." Thomas struggled against the attendant's grip, but the man was far stronger. "You can't keep me here," he gasped. "People know where I am. My editor, my colleagues at the Tribune." "Your editor believes you're investigating asylum conditions in Chattanooga," Vale said with a cold smile. "The letter you sent him before coming here was quite specific. If you disappear, everyone will assume you met with an accident on the road. Such things happen all the time in rural Tennessee." They dragged Thomas through the corridors to a locked ward he hadn't seen during his tour. The cells here were smaller, darker, with iron doors and tiny barred windows. They threw him into one and slammed the door shut, the sound of the lock engaging like a death knell. "Welcome to Rosewood, Patient Brennan," Vale said through the small window in the door. "Dr. Crane is very interested in your brain. He's been wanting to test a new procedure for removing the portions responsible for moral judgment. You'll make an excellent subject." Thomas spent the next 3 days in that cell, listening to the sounds of suffering that filled Rosewood at night. During the day, the building was relatively quiet, the screams muffled by distance and thick walls. But at night, when the public face of the institution fell away, the true nature of Rosewood revealed itself. Thomas learned to recognize the different types of cries. The sobbing of those being dragged to the operating theatre, the high shrieks of those undergoing surgery without adequate anesthetic, the low moans of those dying slowly in their cells from infected surgical wounds. On the 4th morning, an attendant brought Thomas a bowl of thin gruel and a piece of stale bread. The man was younger than the others Thomas had seen, perhaps 25, with a face that still held traces of humanity. "Eat quickly," the attendant said in a low voice, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Tonight they're taking you to the theater. Crane wants to do the procedure during his Friday demonstration for the students from Nashville Medical College. Please," Thomas whispered, "help me. I can pay you. I have money, connections. Just help me get a message out." The attendant's face contorted with an emotion Thomas couldn't quite read. Fear? Guilt? "I can't. If Crane found out, he'd put me on a table. I've seen what he does to people who cross him. I'm sorry, but you're on your own." The attendant left, locking the door behind him. Thomas sat on the narrow cot, his mind racing. He had perhaps 12 hours before they came for him. 12 hours to find a way out, or accept that he would die here, his investigation unfinished, his sister's death unavenged, and the horrors of Rosewood continuing unchecked. He examined every inch of his cell, looking for any weakness, any possible means of escape. The walls were solid brick. The door iron with a lock he had no hope of picking. The small window was too high to reach and too narrow to crawl through, even if he could. There was nothing in the cell except the cot, a wooden bucket for waste, and a thin blanket. Hours passed. Thomas heard the sounds of the asylum's daily routine, meals being distributed, patients being moved from place to place, the occasional scream quickly silenced. As afternoon faded toward evening, he heard footsteps approaching his cell, multiple people moving with purpose. His heart began to race. They were coming for him early, but the footsteps passed his door, stopping at a cell further down the corridor. Thomas pressed his ear to the door, listening. He heard the sounds of a struggle, a woman crying out, then being dragged away. A few moments later, he heard her screaming from the direction of the operating theatre, her cries rising and falling in waves of agony before finally going silent. Night fell. Thomas sat on his cot, trying to prepare himself mentally for what was coming. He thought about his sister Margaret, about how she must have felt in her final days at Hillside Asylum. Had she known what was going to happen to her? Had she been afraid? He thought about Sarah Winters, the young woman scheduled for surgery, about all the patients trapped in institutions like Rosewood across the country, stripped of their freedom and their humanity, subject to the whims of men like Elias Crane, who cloaked their sadism in the language of science. Around midnight, Thomas heard footsteps approaching again. This time they stopped at his door. The lock turned, and the door swung open to reveal Dr. Vale and two attendants. Vale held a syringe filled with clear liquid. "Time for your preoperative sedation, Mr. Brennan," Vale said. "This will make you more docile. Don't fight it. The students will be arriving in an hour. And Dr. Crane wants you properly prepared." Thomas backed against the far wall of his cell. "You can't do this. I'm not insane. I'm a reporter, a citizen. You have no legal right to hold me, much less operate on me." "Legal rights are a fiction created by society," Vale said, advancing into the cell. "Inside these walls, the only law that matters is Dr. Crane's will, and he has decided that your brain will serve science better than it serves you." The attendants grabbed Thomas, one on each arm, forcing him to his knees. Vale approached with the syringe. Thomas struggled desperately, but the men holding him were too strong. He felt the needle pierce his arm, felt the cold liquid entering his bloodstream. Almost immediately, his vision began to blur, his limbs growing heavy. "There," Vale said with satisfaction. "Much better. Take him to the preparation room." They dragged Thomas through the corridors in a drugged haze. The world swam around him, sounds distorting, light smearing into trails of color. He was vaguely aware of being stripped and washed, of his head being shaved, of being dressed in a thin hospital gown. Through it all, he tried to hold on to consciousness, tried to fight against the drug, pulling him down into darkness. When his vision cleared slightly, he found himself strapped to a table in the operating theatre. The tiered seats were filled with young men in dark suits, Medical students come to observe the great Dr. Crane's latest demonstration. Crane himself stood beside the table, explaining his theory of moral degeneracy as a physical disease of the brain tissue. This patient presents with classic symptoms of moral insanity, Crane was saying. Dishonesty, deception, a willingness to violate social norms in pursuit of personal gain. By removing a portion of the frontal lobe, I believe we can eliminate these antisocial tendencies while leaving the patient's basic faculties intact. The procedure is delicate, but has shown promising results in previous subjects. Thomas tried to speak, to cry out to the students that this was murder dressed up as medicine, but the drug had paralyzed his vocal cords. All he could manage was a low moan. Crane looked down at him with those pale green eyes, cold as winter ice. "The patient is ready," Crane announced. "Dr. Vale, if you would administer the additional sedative." Vale approached with another syringe. Thomas felt the needle, felt more cold liquid entering his bloodstream. But this time, instead of drowsiness, he felt a strange clarity descending on him. The world snapped into sharp focus, every detail painfully clear. He could see the individual pores on Crane's face, could hear the breathing of each student in the seats above, could feel every fiber of the straps holding him to the table. Vale had made a mistake, Thomas realized with sudden, terrible understanding. In his arrogance, the assistant director had grabbed the wrong syringe. Instead of sedative, he had injected Thomas with stimulant, one of the drugs Crane used to keep his victims conscious during surgery. Thomas was paralyzed but fully aware, trapped in his own body, about to undergo brain surgery while completely conscious. Crane picked up a scalpel, the blade catching the gaslight. "We'll make the initial incision here," he said, pressing the cold metal against Thomas's scalp. "The pain response will be significant, but the patient is properly restrained." Thomas screamed inside his own mind as Crane cut into his scalp. The pain was indescribable, white-hot and all-consuming. He felt the blade soaring through flesh and tissue, felt warm blood running down the sides of his head. The students leaned forward in their seats, some taking notes, others looking pale and ill. But none of them spoke up, none of them questioned what was happening. Crane worked methodically, peeling back Thomas's scalp to expose the skull beneath. Thomas could see his own reflection in the polished metal instruments laid out on the tray beside the table, could see the horror on his own face, eyes wide and staring, mouth open in a silent scream. He tried desperately to move, to break the straps, to do anything, but his body would not respond. "Now we drill through the skull," Crane continued his lecture. "Note the thickness of the bone. This will take several minutes." The drill touched Thomas's skull, and he felt vibration and pressure as it began to bore through. The sound filled his head, drowning out everything else. Bone dust fell into his eyes, and he couldn't even blink it away. The pain grew worse, if such a thing was possible, as the drill bit through the skull and touched the membrane covering his brain. Then, impossibly, there was a sound from outside the operating theatre, a loud crash followed by shouting. The drill stopped. Crane looked up, irritation crossing his face. The door to the theatre burst open, and men poured in, men in suits and badges, United States Marshals. Leading them was a woman Thomas recognized even through his haze of agony. Sarah Winters, the patient he had seen on his first day, the woman scheduled for surgery. But she was no longer dressed in patient's grey. She wore a proper dress and coat, and her eyes were clear and sharp. "Elias Crane," she said, her voice ringing out clear and strong across the theatre. "I am Sarah Winters, Special Investigator for the United States Department of Justice. You are under arrest for murder, assault, fraud, and violations of the civil rights of the patients under your care." Crane's face went pale, then red with fury. "This is outrageous. This woman is a patient. She's insane. You have no authority here." "I have every authority," Sarah said, producing a badge and federal warrant. "I've been undercover at Rosewood for 6 months, gathering evidence. And this man," she gestured to Thomas, "his arrival and subsequent capture provided the final piece I needed. His editor at the Tribune knew he was coming here. When he failed to check in, federal authorities were notified. We've been waiting outside for hours, documenting who entered the building. We now have names and faces of every medical student who came to watch you commit murder." The students erupted into panic, some trying to flee, others protesting their innocence. The marshals moved quickly, securing the exits and beginning to take people into custody. Sarah crossed to the operating table, her face going white as she saw Thomas's condition. "Get a real doctor in here now," she ordered, "and someone find the keys to these restraints." Thomas felt the straps being released, felt careful hands trying to stabilize his head and stop the bleeding. A doctor arrived, an older man with kind eyes who immediately began working to close the wound. Sarah bent close to Thomas's ear. "Hold on," she whispered. "You're going to survive this. You have to survive to testify." The next hours were a blur of pain and confusion. Thomas was carried from the operating theatre to a proper hospital in nearby Knoxville. Surgeons worked through the night to repair the damage Crane had done, replacing the piece of skull he had drilled through with a metal plate, closing the wounds, fighting the infection that threatened to set in. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, his dreams filled with images of the horrors he had witnessed at Rosewood. When he finally woke fully, it was 5 days later. He was in a hospital room with white walls and clean sheets, sunlight streaming through a window. Sarah Winters sat in a chair beside his bed, reading a newspaper. She looked up when she heard him stir. "Welcome back," she said softly. "We weren't sure you'd make it." Thomas tried to speak, found his throat too dry. Sarah helped him drink water, then settled back in her chair. "I suppose you want to know what happened," she said. Thomas nodded weakly. "After we pulled you out of that theatre, we raided the entire asylum. What we found was even worse than I documented during my 6 months undercover. Crane had been conducting unauthorized medical experiments on patients for nearly 5 years. We found evidence of over 80 deaths directly attributable to his surgeries, and probably twice that many patients who survived but were left permanently damaged. He kept detailed records, thank God. Every procedure documented, every patient named. It's all evidence now." "The others?" Thomas managed to whisper. "Vale? The attendants?" "All arrested. The students who attended that demonstration are being investigated. Some will face charges. Others will lose their medical licenses. The institution itself is being shut down. The surviving patients have been transferred to other facilities, ones with actual oversight." "And Crane?" Sarah's expression hardened. "In custody, awaiting trial. The federal prosecutor is charging him with more than 100 counts of murder and assault. He'll hang for what he did, Thomas. I'll make sure of it." Over the following weeks, as Thomas slowly recovered, the story of Rosewood Asylum broke across the nation. His articles, written from his hospital bed with Sarah's testimony to fill in the gaps, appeared in newspapers from New York to San Francisco. The public was horrified and fascinated in equal measure, unable to look away from the detailed descriptions of Crane's atrocities. The case sparked a national debate about the treatment of the mentally ill, about the power of medical professionals, and about the need for government oversight of institutions that held citizens against their will. The trial of Elias Crane began in the spring of 1874 and lasted 6 weeks. Thomas testified for 3 days, describing everything he had seen and endured. Sarah Winters provided her detailed documentation from her months undercover. Former patients who had survived Crane's surgeries took the stand, showing their scars and describing their suffering. The medical students who had attended demonstrations were called to testify about what they had witnessed. Crane never showed remorse. On the stand, he defended his actions as necessary for the advancement of medical science. He claimed that the patients under his care were hopeless cases, that society benefited from his experiments even if individual subjects suffered. He argued that as a doctor, he had a moral obligation to push the boundaries of knowledge regardless of the cost. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Crane was found guilty on all counts. The judge, an old man who had wept openly during the testimony, sentenced him to death by hanging. But before the sentence could be carried out, Crane died in his cell. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but Thomas always suspected that Crane had somehow obtained poison and taken his own life rather than face the noose. It was a final act of control, a refusal to let society have the last word over his fate. The scandal of Rosewood Asylum led to sweeping reforms in Tennessee and across the country. New laws were passed requiring regular inspections of mental institutions, mandating that patients could not be subjected to medical procedures without consent from family members, establishing standards of care that had to be met. It wasn't enough, Thomas knew. The insane remained vulnerable, their rights tenuous, their treatment often cruel. But it was a start. Sarah Winters left the Justice Department and became an advocate for institutional reform, traveling the country, giving lectures and lobbying state legislatures for stronger protections. She and Thomas remained friends for life, bound together by their shared experience at Rosewood and their determination to ensure that such horrors could never happen again. Thomas continued working as a journalist, but the experience at Rosewood had changed him. He could no longer write with detachment about human suffering. Every story became personal, every injustice a call to action. He focused his work on exposing abuse of power, on giving voice to those who had been silenced, on shining light into the dark corners where cruelty flourished unchecked. The building that had housed Rosewood Asylum stood empty for years, its reputation too dark for anyone to want to use it. Eventually it was torn down, the red bricks scattered and the land returned to wilderness. But Thomas never forgot it. On dark nights, when the wind howled and the temperature dropped, he would lie awake and remember the sounds that had filled those corridors at night, the screams and moans and desperate pleas for mercy that no one had answered. He would remember the patients he hadn't been able to save, the ones who had died on Crane's table before Sarah and the marshals arrived. He would remember the young woman who had reached out to him on his first day, the man Crane had killed during that midnight demonstration, all the nameless victims whose suffering had been hidden behind the walls of that terrible place. And he would remember the lesson that Rosewood had taught him, a lesson written in blood and pain. That freedom was not just a matter of not being physically confined, but of having agency over one's own body, one's own mind, one's own fate. That institutions granted power over the powerless would abuse that power unless vigilantly watched and held accountable. That the price of liberty was not just eternal vigilance, but the courage to act when that vigilance revealed injustice. In 1890, 16 years after the fall of Rosewood Asylum, Thomas Brennan gave a lecture at the Tennessee State Capitol on the occasion of the passage of new legislation strengthening patient rights. He was 44 years old, his hair prematurely grey, the metal plate in his skull sometimes aching when the weather changed. But his mind was sharp, his commitment unshaken. The horrors of Rosewood Asylum, he told the assembled legislators and citizens, were not the actions of one mad doctor. They were the predictable result of a system that stripped certain people of their humanity and their rights. They were enabled by our willingness as a society to look away, to trust that those given power over the vulnerable would exercise that power with wisdom and compassion. That trust was betrayed, as it always will be, when power is exercised without accountability. He paused, letting his words sink in. The patients of Rosewood were American citizens, but their rights as citizens meant nothing once they were labeled insane. They could be confined indefinitely, subjected to any treatment deemed appropriate by their keepers, and if they died, their deaths were dismissed as unfortunate but necessary for the greater good of medical progress. We tell ourselves that we are a free nation, that we protect the rights of all our citizens, but freedom means nothing if it can be stripped away with a medical diagnosis, if the state can delegate absolute power over individuals to institutions that operate in the shadows, beyond public scrutiny. The reforms we enact today are a recognition that true freedom requires that we protect the rights of all citizens, especially those who are most vulnerable, those whose voices are least likely to be heard. Rosewood Asylum was a chamber of horrors, but it could have been any asylum, any institution where people are held against their will and subjected to the authority of those who claim to know what is best for them. The only safeguard against such abuse is transparency, accountability, and the firm recognition that no one, not even a doctor, not even in the name of science, has the right to violate another person's bodily autonomy. Indeed, the reforms passed that day were significant, but Thomas knew they were not enough. The struggle for true liberty, for the protection of human dignity and rights, was never-ending. There would always be those who sought power over others, who justified cruelty in the name of progress, who saw vulnerable people as objects to be used rather than individuals to be respected. But there would also always be people like Sarah Winters, like the anonymous correspondent who had first alerted Thomas to the horrors of Rosewood, like Thomas himself, who refused to look away from injustice, who were willing to risk everything to bring truth to light. That was the other lesson of Rosewood, that ordinary people had the power to resist tyranny, to speak truth to power, to fight for the freedom and dignity of all. Years later, on his deathbed at the age of 72, Thomas Brennan was visited by Sarah Winters, now in her 70s herself. They sat together in the fading light of an October afternoon, two old friends who had faced horror together and survived. "Do you regret it?" Sarah asked. "Going to Rosewood. You lost years of your life to recovery. You still carry the scars." Thomas was quiet for a moment, his hand unconsciously moving to touch the metal plate in his skull. "No," he said finally. "I regret that I couldn't save more of them. I regret that it took so long for anyone to stop Crane. But I don't regret exposing what was happening there. Someone had to bear witness. Someone had to tell their stories." "We changed things," Sarah said. "The reforms we fought for, they've saved lives." "Some lives," Thomas agreed. "But there are still institutions where abuse happens, still vulnerable people whose rights are violated. The fight never ends, Sarah. It just changes form." "Then we train the next generation to continue it," Sarah replied. "Your articles are taught in journalism schools now. My lectures are used in law classes. The story of Rosewood Asylum reminds people why freedom matters, why we can never stop fighting to protect it." They sat in silence as the sun set, two old warriors at rest, knowing that they had done what they could, that they had made a difference, however small, in the great struggle for human dignity and freedom. The horrors of Rosewood Asylum would never be forgotten, would never be allowed to happen again, not while there were people willing to remember and to fight. That night, as Thomas slept, he dreamed of his sister Margaret. In the dream, she was young and healthy, laughing in the sunlight. She took his hand and thanked him, not just for exposing the truth about places like Rosewood, but for remembering that every patient, every victim, every person labeled as different or dangerous or insane was a human being deserving of dignity and respect. He woke with tears on his face, knowing that his time was short, but that his work would outlive him. The story of Rosewood Asylum would be told and retold, a warning and a call to action for every generation. Freedom was not a birthright that could be taken for granted. It was a responsibility that required eternal vigilance, the courage to confront injustice, and the compassion to recognize the humanity in all people, even those society deemed less worthy of protection. The terror of Rosewood Asylum was not that it had happened. The true terror was how easily it had happened, how long it had continued unchecked, how many people had known or suspected the truth and looked away. That was the real horror, not the actions of one sadistic doctor, but the complicity of a society that valued order and authority more than freedom and human dignity. And that was why the story had to be remembered, had to be told again and again to every new generation. Because the darkness that had flourished at Rosewood Asylum still existed, waiting for the moment when vigilance faltered, when people became too comfortable to question authority, too willing to sacrifice the freedom of others for the illusion of their own security. Thomas Brennan died the next morning, peacefully in his sleep. At his funeral, Sarah Winters read from one of his final articles, words that captured everything he had learned from his terrible experience at Rosewood Asylum. "Freedom is not the absence of walls," Thomas had written. "It is the presence of choice. It is the right to determine one's own fate, to control one's own body, to speak one's own truth. It is the recognition that every human being possesses inherent dignity that cannot be stripped away by any authority, no matter how well-intentioned." The patients of Rosewood Asylum were imprisoned not just by iron doors and locked cells, but by a society that had decided their freedom did not matter, that their suffering was acceptable if it served the greater good of medical progress. We must never make that choice again. We must never decide that some people's freedom is less important than others, that some people's dignity can be sacrificed for the benefit of the rest. The moment we make that choice, we open the door to the horrors of Rosewood. We become complicit in cruelty, no matter how much we might tell ourselves that we are serving a higher purpose. The price of freedom is not just vigilance. It is the willingness to defend the rights of those who are most vulnerable, most despised, most easily dismissed. It is the recognition that an injustice against any person is an injustice against all people. It is the courage to confront evil when we see it, no matter the personal cost. That is the lesson of Rosewood Asylum. That is the legacy we must carry forward. May we never forget. The words echoed through the church, a final testament from a man who had stared into the abyss and come back determined to ensure that others would never have to face such horror. The story of Rosewood Asylum lived on, a dark chapter in American history that served as both warning and inspiration, a reminder of what could happen when society turned away from injustice, and of what ordinary people could accomplish when they found the courage to stand against tyranny. In the years that followed, the reforms sparked by the Rosewood scandal continued to evolve and expand. New laws protected the rights of psychiatric patients. New oversight mechanisms were created to monitor institutional care. New voices joined the fight for human dignity and freedom. The work was never finished, the battle never completely won, but each generation built on the foundation laid by people like Thomas Brennan and Sarah Winters. And sometimes, in the old records of Tennessee, in the archives of newspapers and courts and legislatures, someone would come across the story of Rosewood Asylum and the surgeon who had turned healing into horror. They would read the testimonies of survivors, the detailed accounts of Crane's atrocities, the descriptions of that final, desperate night when Thomas Brennan had lain on an operating table with his skull exposed, about to become another victim of medical tyranny. And they would understand, perhaps for the first time, why freedom mattered, not as an abstract concept or a political slogan, but as a concrete reality that meant the difference between life and death, between dignity and degradation, between being treated as a human being or as an object to be used and discarded. That was the true legacy of Rosewood Asylum. Not the horror itself, but the understanding that came from confronting that horror. The recognition that freedom was fragile, that human rights were not self-enforcing, that eternal vigilance was not just a saying, but a necessity. And most importantly, that ordinary people had the power to make a difference, to expose injustice, to fight for the dignity of all. The building was gone. The doctor was dead. The patients were released or buried, but the lesson remained, written in the scar tissue on Thomas Brennan's skull, recorded in Sarah Winter's detailed documentation, preserved in the laws and reforms that emerged from the scandal. Rosewood Asylum was gone, but it would never be forgotten. And that forgetting, that remembering, was the real battle. Because as long as people remembered what had happened at Rosewood, as long as they understood how easily institutional power could become institutional tyranny, there was hope that such horrors would never happen again. The story was the safeguard, the memory was the protection, the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths was the price of freedom. Thomas Brennan had paid that price with his body and his peace of mind. Sarah Winters had paid it with years of her life spent undercover in a place of horror. The patients of Rosewood had paid it with their suffering and too often with their lives. But their sacrifice had not been in vain. The reforms they had inspired, the awareness they had created, the changes they had forced upon a reluctant society, all of these lived on. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not that horror had existed, but that people had found the courage to confront it, to expose it, to ensure that it could never flourish again in the darkness of public indifference. The terror of Rosewood Asylum was real, but so was the triumph of those who had brought it to an end. That was the story Thomas Brennan had lived to tell. That was the legacy he left behind. And as long as that story was remembered, as long as new generations learned from the horrors of the past and committed themselves to protecting the freedom and dignity of all people, the suffering of Rosewood's victims would not have been meaningless. They would be remembered not as anonymous patients in a forgotten asylum, but as human beings whose suffering had sparked a movement for change, whose stories had awakened a nation's conscience, whose deaths had not been in vain. That was the justice they deserved, the memorial they had earned, the freedom they had helped to secure for future generations.